A thin cry cuts across the hillside, brittle as the wind between the olive trees. Sheep scatter in startled arcs, their bells clanging, their hooves scraping loose stones. A boy's voice rises again, urgent, breathless. "Wolf! A wolf is in the flock." Villagers drop their tools. Someone knocks over a basket of figs. They run uphill with staffs and pitchforks, lungs burning, the dust in their mouths sharp as grit. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. If you're into this kind of deep dive, tap like and subscribe. They crest the ridge, expecting teeth and blood, but the only thing waiting is the boy himself, leaning on his crook, grinning through the sweat. His eyes are bright with mischief. His laugh hangs in the warm air just long enough to sting. Grumbles rise. Threats muttered, he waves them away. "Only a joke," he says. They file back down toward the fields, muttering about wasted work. Days pass. Then it happens again. The boy's cry shatters the afternoon, urgent as a temple bell. Again they run. Again, nothing, just his smirk. And on the third day, when the sheep's bellows turn to screams, when something grey and low slinks through the grass with yellow eyes fixed on wool, the boy's voice rips the air, but this time, no one climbs the hill. By the time the wolf is gone, only bones and torn fleece remain. This is the story you've heard since childhood. But what if I told you it's older than the Bible's oldest books? That its bones might have been laid down 3.5 millennia ago, whispered across campfires before Greek had an alphabet? That somewhere, buried beneath the moral about telling the truth, is a shadow of a ritual, a warning from a vanished world? The stakes are simple but brutal. If we misread the roots of this fable, we miss the deep seam of human fear and trust. It comes from a seam that once determined who lived and who died in the hills. The familiar version, the one bound in bright paper and read before bed, comes in the clean prose of modern retellings. A mischievous boy, a repeated lie, a predator ignored until it strikes. But roll the centuries backward, and the words begin to fray. In some, the boy is a shepherd. In others, just a villager's child sent to watch the communal flock. Sometimes, the wolf never comes. Sometimes, it comes only once, and the boy dies. It's easy to picture the version recorded in English by William Caxton in 1484, titled plainly "The Boy Who Cried Wolf," or Heinrich Steinhuel's German telling from the late 15th century. But their crisp sentences are the afterimage of something much rougher. Go back further, past the Latin de mendas puero from 1574, past the verse fables of Phaedrus in the 1st century, past the scattered references by Ennius and Horace, and you land somewhere in the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean in the 4th century before Christ. There, the statesman Demetrius of Phalerum compiles a written set of tales attributed to a man called Aesop it, Sigma Omega Pi, Omicron Zeus, whose very name is a puzzle, its origin obscure, its syllables echoing down from an oral tradition centuries old. Demetrius is working in a time when Athens is still licking its wounds from lost wars, when the countryside hums with herders and vineyards, and when a well-timed false alarm could mean the difference between saving a herd or losing a season's wealth. The fable is Peri-Index number 210, a label given much later to sort it among hundreds of Aesop's tales. Unlike the sprawling sagas of other traditions, it's bare-boned, efficient, which is why it travels so well. Pastoral communities from Anatolia to the Cyclades knew the cost of an untimely lie. One wasted rush uphill could be forgiven. Two could sour the trust that kept a village's animals alive. We know the text on the page is 2,325 years old at most, but when you strip it back to its core child, false alarm, predator, consequence, it reads like a cultural reflex, a learned behavior encoded in story form. Could it have lived in the mouths of shepherds long before any scribe inked the first line? The 3,500 years in our title is a provocation, an open question. The archaeological record is silent, but oral tradition is notoriously older than its first writing. Picture it, a Bronze Age hillside somewhere in what is now Western Turkey. Sheep clustered in makeshift folds. A boy, call him whatever name fits the dialect of the time, watches for movement beyond the firelight. The darkness is alive with noise, cicadas, the rustle of night wind, and sometimes something heavier, deliberate. If his cry is false too often, no one will come. In an age without walls or alarms, that's more than a lesson. It's a law, but here's where it gets strange. This lean little tale has survived the fall of empires, the shifting of languages, the invention of printing, and the moral makeovers of the Victorian nursery. And each time, the voice at its center is still that of the boy on the hill, carrying over the stone and the grass. In the next section, we'll peel back the layers of ink and parchment to see exactly how that voice traveled from the Greek hillsides into Latin verse, across the presses of medieval Europe, and into the illustrated books on our shelves. The question is, what changed along the way, and why? The boy's cry fades into the centuries, but the trail it leaves is surprisingly traceable. We begin in the 4th century before Christ, in Athens, where Demetrius of Phalerum compiles the earliest known written collection of Aesop's fables. The language is Greek, the tone brisk, the purpose at least in part political. These fables are not meant only for children. They're moral ammunition for orators and statesmen, parables to slip into speeches like a well-placed dagger. The earliest secure version of our fable sits here in that collection, marked today as Peri Index number 210. But Demetrius is already working with material that has lived orally for generations. Scholars note that the structure of the story setup, repetition, reversal, mirrors patterns in Near Eastern and Egyptian didactic tales that predate Greek literacy. This doesn't prove the fable is 3,500 years old, but it does suggest a deep oral root system. From Athens, the story migrates into Latin. In the 1st century of our era, Phaedrus, a freed slave under Augustus, transforms Aesop's prose into tight verse. He gives the shepherd boy a Roman cadence, trims the dialogue, and delivers the moral with the sharpness of a legal verdict. Phaedrus's version circulates among the literate elite, used in rhetorical training. A century earlier, the poets Ennius and Horace had already alluded to similar themes: false alarms, eroded trust, indicating the motif was well known. Then the record goes dark for nearly a millennium. The Roman Empire falls, Europe fragments, and much of the classical canon lies dormant in monastic scriptoria. The fable survives in scattered manuscripts, copied in Latin alongside biblical parables and saints' lives. Somewhere in this long winter, the tone begins to shift. The fable is no longer just a political barb or an exercise in rhetoric. It's becoming a moral lesson for the young. The late 15th century blows the dust off the story. In Germany, Heinrich Steinhuel publishes a lavishly illustrated collection of Aesop's fables, drawing from both Latin and vernacular sources. His shepherd boy and the wolf is crisp, moralistic, and, thanks to the printing press, suddenly available to a public far beyond scholars and monks. 2 years later, in 1484, William Caxton, England's first printer, translates and publishes his own version. He keeps the core intact: the boy, the lies, the wolf, the fatal consequence. But he also standardizes the language, planting the seed for the English idiom to cry wolf. This is the version that will echo into the modern age. Other adaptations follow. Ossius in 1574 titles his Latin version De Mendes Puero, the boy who lied. Roger Lestrange in 1692 renames it A Boy and False Alarms, framing it for Restoration audiences. George Filer Townsend's 1867 The Shepherd Boy and the Wolf trims the language even further, perfect for Victorian moral instruction. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, poets like John Hookham Frere, William Ellery Leonard, and Louis Untermeyer toy with the ending, sometimes sparing the boy, sometimes letting the wolf take him. The transmission route is almost a case study in cultural survival. An oral Greek pastoral warning, codified in Attic prose, recast in Latin verse, preserved in monastic Latin, reborn in German woodcuts, naturalized into English print, and finally retooled for the global children's market. Each stage strips and polishes different facets of the tale. What's striking is what doesn't change. The core conflict, truth versus credibility, remains untouched. Even as the wolf becomes more symbolic than zoological, the stakes of ignoring a real danger after repeated lies stay vivid. The 19th century cements the story as a nursery staple. But this is also when Bowdlerization sets in. Earlier versions had no qualms about ending with the boy's death or the gruesome loss of sheep. Victorian editions often spare him, allowing for a stern talking to instead. This wasn't just squeamishness, it was a recalibration of what childhood was for, turning the fable into a safe, instructive space, rather than a brush with existential danger. And yet, those darker versions never vanish entirely. They resurface in poetic reworkings, in stage adaptations, and in the whispered memory of older printings. The story's transmission is not a straight line, but a braid, threads of comedy, morality, and mortality intertwining across languages and centuries. It's here, in tracing these threads, that we can start to measure its age with some confidence. The earliest written form? 2,325 years old. The possible oral ancestry? Maybe much older, though beyond the reach of proof, which raises a question: if we can't date the birth of the story, can we at least classify its DNA? Folklorists have tried, with mixed success. In the next section, we'll break open the code, the Perry Index number, the absence of a formal ATU classification, and what the lack of a Thompson motif code tells us about the strange place this fable occupies in the map of world storytelling. Is it a true folktale at all, or something else entirely? Picture a vast library, but instead of shelves, it's lined with drawers. Each drawer holds a type of story, fairy tale, legend, animal fable filed and numbered by folklorists over the last century. This is the Arne Thompson Uther Index, a taxonomy of human storytelling. You might expect The Boy Who Cried Wolf to have its own neat label here, but when you pull at the drawers, you find something odd. No ATU number at all. That's because the ATU system, while encyclopedic, was built primarily to classify folktales, not fables. Fables, short, moral-driven animal tales, have often been filed under their own systems. For Aesop's corpus, the key tool is the Perry Index, compiled by Ben Edwin Perry in the 20th century. In this system, our boy sits at number 210, nestled among other pastoral cautionary tales. Why no ATU code? Partly because this is a lean parable, not a multi-scene narrative. It doesn't fit the branching plot structures ATU is designed to trace. It's more like a proverb with legs, a single loop of cause and effect. That structural simplicity may be why it survived so cleanly for so long. There's no fat to trim, no subplot to lose in translation. If we look for a place in Stith Thompson's motif index of folk literature, we find only approximations. The core could be aligned with motifs about lying punished or false alarms leading to disaster, but no single code is routinely cited. Scholars suggest it overlaps with moralistic animal tales found from India to Scandinavia, but without the supernatural or magical elements that dominate folktale motifs. This absence in the grand catalogue makes the age math more important. The earliest secure written form dates to the 4th century before Christ. That's 2,325 years as of today. To hit the headline figure of 3,500, we'd have to push the origin back another 12 centuries, somewhere around 1500 before Christ. That's the late Bronze Age, the era of Mycenaean palaces, Hittite chariots, and the Egyptian New Kingdom. Could the core idea of false alarm leading to ignored truth exist that far back? Certainly. Any community dependent on collective defense, from herders in the Anatolian highlands to guards at Nile outposts, would learn fast the cost of eroded trust. The absence of textual proof doesn't mean the lesson wasn't told, only that we can't follow it across the gap. One intriguing clue is linguistic. The word wolf in ancient Greek is lambda, ikapa, omikrons, lycos, a term that surfaces in countless Indo-European languages, Latin lupus, Old Norse ulfa, Old English wolf. The predator was so embedded in the lives and fears of pastoral cultures that its name traveled with them. If the warning was there, the word to name it was too. And then there's Aesop himself, a sigma omega pi omicron cis, in modern English pronunciation. We don't know what his name meant, or if he even existed as a single historical figure. In a way, that's fitting. The teller is less important than the told. The boy could be anyone. The wolf could be any threat. What matters is the moral. Trust, once squandered, cannot be summoned at will. But here's where classification becomes more than an academic exercise. By not fitting neatly into the ATU system, the boy who cried wolf escapes some of the evolutionary tracking that folklorists apply to stories. We can't plot its branches across a map in the same way we can with, say, Cinderella or Little Red Riding Hood. That makes its persistence even stranger. It's a story we can't fully pin down, and yet it's everywhere. Ben Edwin Perry's Index ties it tightly to the Aesopic tradition, but that tradition itself is porous, absorbing, adapting, and exporting material across cultures. And while the ATU drawers stay shut for this fable, the moral slides easily into other traditions, wearing different animal skins or human guises. That's the thread we'll pick up next. Because if we can't find its twin in the ATU cabinet, maybe we can find its cousins, stories in other cultures that carry the same DNA. A false alarm in medieval Japan, a lying hunter in West Africa, a trickster warning in the highlands of Peru. What changes in those tellings and what stays unbroken? Step outside the Greek hillside, and the boy's voice begins to sound different. The words change, the animals change, the stakes shift, but the heartbeat of the story remains. A false alarm, a community stirred, a truth ignored, a cost paid. In West Africa, the Akan people tell of a hunter who, eager for attention, repeatedly announces the presence of dangerous game near the village. He wants prestige, the status of a skilled tracker. But when a real leopard stalks the outskirts, his shouts go unanswered. The leopard kills his prized hunting dog, a loss as personal and devastating as losing a sheep flock in Greece. The moral is the same. Squander trust, and it may not be there when you need it. In the highlands of Peru, Quechua oral tradition offers a similar warning in the story of the Liar of the Llama herd. A young herder fabricates tales of pumas attacking the herd, pulling elders from their weaving and children from their games. When the puma finally comes, the llamas scatter into the mountains, many lost forever. Here, the animal is local, the terrain high and cold, but the emotional shape of the tale mirrors its Mediterranean cousin. Medieval Japan gives us the parable of the false fire watchman. In Edo period cities, fire was the most feared disaster. Watchmen stationed in tall wooden towers kept eyes on the horizon, ringing bells when smoke appeared. In one telling, a young watchman rings his bell for sport, watching the scramble below. When a true blaze lights the night, no one responds quickly enough, and an entire row of houses burns. The wolf has become fire, but the human error abusing the alarm hasn't changed. Even Northern Europe holds echoes. In Norse settlements, sagas mention the shame of men who call for aid against raiders too often without cause. One Icelandic fragment speaks of a young man who cried war to see the longboats rally. only to be ignored when an actual raiding party appeared at the fjord. Here, the wolf is a ship, the teeth are iron axes, and the herd is the village itself. These parallels aren't proof of direct borrowing. They're proof of something older and perhaps more durable, the universality of communal defense. In any society where survival depends on swift collective action, whether to guard sheep, llamas, homes, or harbors, a false alarm erodes the invisible contract between the caller and the called. Once that cord is frayed, the whole structure is weaker. Transmission could have played a role. Greek seafarers, Roman legions, Silk Road merchants all carried tales along with goods. Aesop's fables, translated into multiple languages, were part of school curricula from the Islamic Golden Age to the colonial outposts of Europe. But some of these variants seem too rooted in local ecology to be direct imports. The Quechua herder's puma, the Edo watchman's fire, they make sense only where those dangers live. This raises an intriguing possibility. The motif is not a single river flowing from a single source, but a set of springs bubbling up wherever the conditions are right. Different mountains, different predators, same moral sediment. The boy may not be the same boy, but his mistake is instantly recognizable. What's also notable is how the consequence shifts. In the Greek version, the boy often loses the sheep, or in darker tellings, his own life. In some African and Andean tellings, the loss is framed as communal property, with the trickster shamed but not killed. In the Japanese variant, the cost is the destruction of homes less personal but more catastrophic. This variation reflects each culture's calculus of danger. What's the most painful, believable thing that could happen if no one answers the call? And yet, across all these echoes, the human element is the same. Someone seeks attention, amusement, or status, abuses the community's readiness, and learns too late that trust is not a resource you can waste without consequence. But that raises a question. Why the wolf? Of all animals in the Mediterranean world, why does the Greek tale anchor itself to this one predator? Is it just because wolves were common livestock threats? Or is there a deeper symbolic charge here, one that reaches beyond the practical danger? In the next section, we'll slip back into the Greek hills, but this time with a different lens, not as historians or folklorists, but as anthropologists decoding ritual symbols. What does the wolf mean in ancient pastoral societies? Why is the liar a boy? And what hidden rites or warnings might this children's story still be carrying? The wolf, in the Greek imagination, is more than just a hungry animal. In ancient pastoral societies, it was a walking embodiment of chaos, an intelligent, coordinated hunter that could appear without warning, undo months of work in a single night, and vanish into the dark before the shepherd could gather help. In the highlands of Arcadia, or the plains of Thessaly, a wolf wasn't just a predator, it was the edge of the world pressing in. The ancient Greek word lambda, e kappa omicron, slikos, was not neutral. It appears in myths, omens, even place names, often tied to themes of destruction and transformation. The god Apollo bore the epithet Lycaos in certain cults, possibly linking him to both the protective and destructive qualities of the wolf. In ritual terms, the animal could be both sacred and profane, feared for its appetite, respected for its cunning. So when an Aesopic fable chooses the wolf as the final danger, it's choosing a predator that resonates on multiple levels: practical threat, mythic symbol, and moral shorthand for danger that cannot be reasoned with. The arrival of the wolf is the moment when chaos enters the safe space, when the social order either rallies or fails. And why a boy? In pastoral economies, boys were often tasked with tending the flocks on the outskirts of the village, close enough to run for help, far enough to be alone with their thoughts. They were untested members of the community, still learning the rules of trust and responsibility. The boy in the fable isn't just a child. He's a liminal figure, poised between the dependency of childhood and the accountability of adulthood. His mistake is both personal and public. He learns the cost of deceit, and the community learns the cost of relying on someone not yet reliable. There's another layer here too. In ancient societies, alarms, whether shouts, horns, or fire signals, were sacred acts. To call the community to arms was to invoke a collective response, one that disrupted daily rhythms and put lives at risk. A false alarm wasn't just inconvenient, it was a breach of trust that could weaken the readiness of the group for real threats. This is why the story feels older than its first writing. The stakes it encodes are survival level. The repetition in the fable first false alarm, second false alarm, final ignored truth mirrors the threefold pattern common in Indo-European storytelling. This triplet rhythm serves both as a mnemonic device in oral tradition and as a symbolic progression. The first test is curiosity, the second is habit, the third is judgment day. In this case, the judgment falls not in a courtroom, but in the jaws of the wolf, and the setting a hillside, the open air, the separation between boy and village cements the ritual undertone. In some readings, the boy is almost like a novice in a rite of passage, sent out to perform a role and judged on his reliability. Failing the test, he loses not just sheep, but his standing in the group. This blend of practical herding life, mythic predator, and social ritual makes the fable's symbolism unusually dense for such a short story. It's also why it survives translation into cultures where wolves don't exist. In those places, the predator shifts puma, leopard, fire, but the symbolic structure remains: chaos at the boundary, an untested guardian, and a breach of trust that lets the danger in. But symbolism alone doesn't explain how the story has been interpreted, softened, or weaponized over time. To understand that, we need to step into the arena of debates and misconceptions, what scholars agree on, what they dispute, and what popular culture often gets wrong about this deceptively simple tale. In the next section, we'll strip away the comforting layers to confront the myths about Aesop himself, the ancient age of the fable, and the modern distortions that have turned a survival lesson into bedtime moralizing. The first myth to debunk is about Aesop himself. The neat schoolbook image, a single man, born around 620 before Christ, traveling Greece and personally crafting hundreds of fables, is almost certainly false. Ancient sources about him are sparse and often contradictory. What we call Aesop's fables is better understood as a body of oral tales circulating in the Eastern Mediterranean, later collected and attributed to a single name for convenience. The boy on the hillside, he might have been told and retold centuries before Aesop ever became a brand. The second myth is embedded in our own title, 3,500 years old. It's a powerful phrase, but the hard evidence stops far short of that. The oldest secure written record is Demetrius of Phalerum compilation in the 4th century before Christ, about 2,325 years ago. Pushing it back another 12 centuries into the late Bronze Age is plausible only in the sense that humans have always told cautionary tales about liars and danger. Without inscriptions or artifacts, the extra years are speculation. That doesn't make the oral roots any less interesting, but it does mean we should treat them as possibility, not proof. Then there's the idea that the wolf has always been the same wolf. In reality, the predator in the tale has changed many times. In Louis Untermeyer's 1965 version, the wolf actually eats the boy, a detail stripped from many Victorian editions to protect young readers. In Roger Lestrange's 17th century England, the fable becomes a boy and false alarms, more concerned with generalized deceit than pastoral life. And in non-European variants, the wolf disappears entirely, replaced by whatever danger best fits the local landscape. Bowdlerization is another layer of distortion. By the 19th century, particularly in English-language children's publishing, the appetite for grim endings had waned. Publishers like George Filer Townsend recast the story so the boy learns his lesson without losing his life or his entire flock. These softened endings turned a survival warning into a moral lecture, a safe way to teach honesty, but stripped of the visceral stakes that made the original effective. We also have to address the misconception that the boy who cried wolf is universal in its exact form. While the motif of a false alarm is globally common, the specific structure of a mischievous child, a community, and a single predator is largely a Mediterranean and European product. The Andean herder's puma, the Edo watchman's fire, or the West African hunter's leopard share the moral but not the cultural specifics. Scholarly debates, though few, cluster around classification. The absence of an ATU number has led some to argue the fable sits outside the true folktale tradition. Others counter that its structure and oral transmission make it indistinguishable in practice from shorter folktales. Ben Edwin Perry's index places it firmly within the Aesopic tradition, but without the branching family tree that allows folklorists to trace narrative evolution across continents. Even the moral isn't immune to reinterpretation. In political rhetoric, crying wolf has been used to discredit warnings about everything from environmental collapse to public health crises, sometimes fairly, sometimes cynically. In these contexts, the fable is wielded less as a caution about lying and more as a bludgeon against those sounding alarms. This twist flips the original danger on its head. Now the story can be used to silence true warnings under the suspicion they might be false. And finally, there's the modern pop cultural flattening. Cry wolf has become shorthand for any overreaction, often divorced from its communal stakes. The original wasn't about embarrassment or minor inconvenience, it was about survival, about the moment when your call for help no longer works and the thing you feared walks in unopposed. Recognizing these distortions matters because each layer of myth, misread, and missing teeth changes what the story does in the mind of the listener. If you think it's about politeness, you miss the survival calculus. If you think it's ancient beyond question, you miss the fascination of tracing it to a concrete moment in literary history. If you think Aesop invented it, you miss the fingerprints of countless anonymous tellers who kept it alive before ink ever touched parchment. So where does that leave us? A story with a clear earliest record, a probable deep oral past, a predator that's changed skins across cultures, and a moral that's been sharpened, dulled, and weaponized in turn. Which begs the final question. Why has it lasted at all, and why does it still hit so hard when told well? That's where we're headed in our last section, where we'll stitch together the boy, the wolf, and the cultures that kept them alive, and see why the cry still echoes in our heads millennia later. The boy's voice survives because it strikes two notes at once, one ancient and primal, the other endlessly adaptable. On the primal side, it encodes a survival mechanism so obvious that any society depending on collective defense would recognize it. If you waste the community's readiness, you weaken the community itself. This isn't just morality, it's math. Trust is finite, and when it's gone, danger wins. On the adaptable side, the fable is a chameleon. It works in a Greek hillside, a Peruvian pasture, a Japanese city watchtower, or a West African hunting ground. Swap the wolf for a puma, a fire. A leopard swap the boy for a watchman, a herder, a soldier, and the structure holds. The story's bones are so lean, so perfectly balanced between setup and consequence, that they travel without breaking. Psychologically, it hits where we live. The boy's mistake is universal, pushing a boundary to see what happens, enjoying the rush of attention, then realizing too late that some bridges burn after only 2 crossings. We recognize him because we've been him in childhood pranks, in overplayed warnings, even in relationships stretched thin by too many false alarms. That recognition fuels the story's staying power, whether told in a schoolyard or from a podium. Culturally, it endures because it's useful. Ancient Greek orators could drop it into a speech to warn against political alarmism. Medieval preachers could wield it against gossip. Modern journalists use it as a shorthand for discredited warnings. Parents still read it to children, even if the teeth are blunted, to teach that words have consequences. It's a multi-tool of moral storytelling, always ready to be pulled from the belt. But perhaps its greatest strength is that it still works when told straight. No flashy subplots, no elaborate character arcs, just a rhythm. Call, call, silence. The repetition builds expectation. The silence delivers the blow. The audience leans forward in the first two cries and leans back in the third, powerless to stop what's coming. In that moment, the story turns from performance to ritual, reenacting the exact danger it warns about, the call that goes unanswered. The boy himself is part of the hook. His youth makes the lesson sharper. There's tragedy in someone learning too late, and there's a social edge in watching the untested fail a communal task. In cultures where initiation rites mark the passage to adulthood, the fable reads almost like a failed initiation. The boy was given a role, proved unworthy, and suffered the cost. That's a warning young listeners feel in their bones. Even the wolf, or its stand-in, remains potent. In an age when real wolves are rare in much of Europe, the word still carries weight. It's shorthand for something cunning, dangerous, and close enough to touch if you're careless. In the idiom, cry wolf, the animal has become metaphorical, but the menace hasn't faded. The phrase appears in dictionaries, political speeches, and everyday conversations, always anchored to that ancient image of danger at the edge of the fold. And yet, the story is fragile. Strip away the consequence, as in many modern children's editions, and you risk turning it into a hollow moral, a "be honest" sticker instead of a survival code. Leave the consequence in, and you preserve the visceral jolt that makes the lesson unforgettable. That tension between comfort and truth is one reason the fable keeps evolving, each age deciding how much bite to leave in the wolf's mouth. So why does the cry still carry? Because at its core, it's a social contract in miniature. One voice calls, many respond, break that, and the whole web of trust thins. In an era of instant alerts and constant notifications, the ancient warning feels almost prophetic. If you flood the signal, no one will hear you when it matters. And that's the unsettling twist to leave you with. Maybe the boy's voice hasn't survived for 3,500 years because it's quaint or clever, but because every generation needs to hear it and needs to fear being him. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger, the 2,800-year-old secret behind the tortoise and the hare. Subscribe before it drops, and be ready when the starting gun fires.